And I'm going to switch over while we have a little bit of your time left, sir, to information security. As I showed in that macro survey here, the information security priorities is number one in general. And then when we break it down further, we see that identity and endpoint are high. I was a little bit surprised to see vulnerability management patching as high as it was. And the only reason I say that is simply because I always kind of view that as basic hygiene. Like for me, I've been in the space for a long time, and I'm like, well, of course you have to do scanning and patching. Of course you have to have asset management, know what's out there and make sure it's updated. So to see that as the number one, I was really, really surprised. I'm going to pull up again the three main players in that space: Qualys, Rapid7, and Tenable. Maybe your thoughts, reactions on why vulnerability management might be tied as the number one security priority right now?
Well, if you think about, I remember, and I was working with a company that was doing sales, and if you look at one of the most highly sold objects, in the country are refrigerators, right? Pretty basic thing, right? So this is kind of like, this is a very high, basic control that if you don't do that, it's kind of table stakes for existing in the world right now. And if you don't do a good job on this, you're going to be much more vulnerable. So I think that's why it's so high still. It's not sexy anymore, but it's something that you have to do. And if you're not doing it well, you're going to be in trouble. Yes. And then we see that with the pervasiveness of ransomware.
Yes, very much so. And you mentioned earlier about this adaptive learning and large language models and natural language processing. That's gonna, I hate to use the word, but it's going to help the bad actors as well, particularly on the nation state bad actors. I just think it's going to increase the efficacy and frequency of attacks when they start using, OpenAI and ChatGPT and those type of technologies. So I think all basic security hygiene, particularly email and patching, are going to become more important.
Absolutely. I mean, and that, that is so critical now. And of course, the end user, right, and education, and
yes,
that's a critical piece too, because they're the ones that are already inside your environment, and if they make a mistake, that can cause a lot of problems. I think there needs to be a big focus on that. That might be more administrative controls and training. However, it is a critical piece. But it's really, you need all of the above now. So what I've challenged the CISO currently works for me is to look at the number of vendors we're using and see if there's some efficiency. And if you look at that Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap. So maybe we can reduce that footprint and gain efficiencies that way. So that's something that we've been working on. But everything that you had in that previous chart, you need to have all of that, all of the above. And it's not getting, like you say, it's not getting any better.
Real quickly, I just threw up a company called KnowBe4 because you mentioned training, and this is just, might not be the vendor that you use, but it just showed that in an environment where a lot of things are coming down, the training vendors are seeing growth. It's incredibly important. And if I could just real quickly stick with the vulnerability management names, we're seeing them 20s net score. I'm sorry, we're in Pervasion right now. I'm going to go back to overall spending. My apologies. We're seeing Tenable come down. That's based on the open source Nessus, but all of them are in the low 20s. And just for context, that's not very high in our survey. The most superior names will have net scores in the 40s. Healthy names will be in the mid to high 30s. When you see low 20s, we're seeing basically spending coming down, or the company's more maturing a bit. I'm curious, sir, do you have any experience with these three? Any preferences, any differentiation between these three vulnerability management players?
Yeah, well, I've worked with Tenable and Rapid7, and I think they're both really good companies. I think they're doing, a good job. I think that it might be that the market is getting a little bit more diluted. That might be more why their spend per company is going down versus anything, from a particular standpoint from the solutions that they're providing. But the other thing is all of these companies are looking at adding, all of those other, cybersecurity type aspects so that they become a more comprehensive solution. Again, you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket either, but again, what is that sweet spot of how many vendors and how in depth and how they work together? That's one thing I've seen in some of my previous jobs where you have 4 or 5 security vendors that are almost fighting each other. Yes. Then you're adding a lot of agents to the endpoint that brings performance down. So you really do want to have a good cybersecurity architect that can go in and kind of tune that, engineer that really so that you're more efficient, but as secure as you can be.
And I'm going to move over a little bit to that endpoint side as I take off the vulnerability management names. One other thing I want to just ask or mention on vulnerability management is, as enterprises become a little bit more mature and they start using more cloud native compute and container compute, it's also an aspect that there's a lot of emerging players that are built for cloud native and container and Kubernetes native type of environments. And I'm not sure particularly that Tenable, Rapid7, Qualys would be your first choice if you were moving to that environment. There's a lot of emerging players that are putting some pressure on them as well, I believe.
Yeah, there's a lot of startups out there. I get invited to a lot of those informational type meetings where, they are cloud native, a lot of them emerging out of Israel right now. And I think that's exciting to see, because as everything does move to the cloud, being cloud native and not having to port it into the cloud, or, having, kind of like when a new vendor for ERP, starts from the ground up versus having to inherit something that's, 30 years old.
Right,
You
exactly.
can certainly be more efficient and new technology, and again, incorporating AI and ML as well.